Self-driving cars are getting so good that a neurosurgeon in Pennsylvania is calling them a public health breakthrough. Hello, and welcome to Auto Be Careful, the place for car safety. I'm Gene, and today I'm so excited because I'm going to take my first ride in a self-driving car and talk about what the experience is like, why one doctor is calling them a public health breakthrough, and whether or not it makes sense to replace these human-driven cars with self-driving ones. Let's get into it. For this video, I'm going to focus specifically on Waymo, and I'll talk about why a little later in the video. The first thing we need to do is download the app. Once it's downloaded, we open it up and create an account. The first thing we learn is if Waymo is available in our area. As of filming, Waymo currently operates in roughly 10 areas, and we are lucky enough to be in one of those areas today. After that, it's pretty easy to request a ride. Simply put in the destination location, and the app uses the phone's location to estimate the starting point, plan the route, give a distance estimation, and a time estimation. If you've used other rideshare services, such as Uber or Lyft, this is going to look pretty familiar. One difference you may see if you're in an area like ours is a notice that Waymo does not currently have authorization to operate self-driving vehicles on highways, so trips may take longer because they have to use local roads. While we wait for our car, let's talk a little bit about Waymo. Waymo traces its roots all the way back to 2004 as Stanford University's self-driving car team. Since these humble beginnings, they have grown substantially. In 2025, they provided over 14 million rides and added several new cities to their service areas. For most of that time, they've only had approval to provide rides on local roads. However, starting in November of 2025, they began to get approvals to operate on highways in some areas as well. They are the biggest self-driving car company, and they do one thing better than all of their competitors. They are incredibly transparent. I am not kidding. They publish more data about their self-driving successes and failures than any of their competitors. You can see how many collisions they've had, how many injuries they've had, and how many miles they've driven. This transparency is why we're focusing on Waymo for this video. So, as I mentioned, the experience so far has been pretty similar to Uber and Lyft.
But you'll quickly realize the difference the moment the car arrives. These vehicles have a lot of bulbous sensors on the outside to detect their surroundings, and the strangest feature is there is no driver. You step into the vehicle, tap the screen to start the ride, and then you're off.
And it is weird. I'm in the backseat of this vehicle by myself, which is absolutely crazy. This is my first time in the back of one of these things, and I am a little bit nervous. It's moments like this that I start to think about all of those sensationalized news stories that have been going around, like the Waymos that blew past a stopped school bus that was letting kids off, or the time that Waymos clogged the streets of San Francisco because they couldn't communicate during a power outage, or the number of deaths that have occurred in self-driving cars. It's pretty terrifying. With all of that in mind, you may be wondering why I'm doing this. As I mentioned at the start of the video, Dr. Slotkin, who is a neurosurgeon in Pennsylvania, took a look at the statistics from Waymo and believes that these self-driving vehicles are a public health breakthrough. The statistics were pretty amazing. Compared to human drivers on the same roads, Waymo vehicles were 91% less likely to be involved in a collision with a serious injury or worse, and 80% less likely to be involved in a collision with any injury. Let that sink in. Compared to a human driver, Waymo vehicles are statistically 80% less likely to be involved in an injury-causing collision. He also noted that Waymo vehicles are 96% less likely to be involved in an injury-causing collision at an intersection. To really drive home the impact of this, crashes are the number 2 cause of death for children and young adults. Plus, 39,000 Americans died in vehicle collisions in 2024. If the number of motor vehicle deaths was reduced by that same 91% drop that Waymo produced in severe injury or worse collisions, the number of Americans killed in 2024 would have dropped from 39,000 to 3,500. That would save roughly 35,000 lives every year. To put that another way, 9 out of the 10 motor vehicle collisions that either paralyze or kill someone today would simply disappear. So if this technology is such a huge lifesaver, why aren't we using it everywhere? One big reason is the cost. The cost of adding all of the equipment required in order for a vehicle to be able to drive itself is roughly $100,000 on top of the price of the vehicle. The average price of a new car today is $50,000. So adding this equipment to that average car price would triple the cost of the vehicle to $150,000. That would price most new car buyers out of the new car market and make the price of buying a new vehicle comparable to that of buying a house. And if you've taken a ride in a Waymo, you can see that in the cost of a ride. My 19-mile daily commute costs roughly $35 in an Uber or a Lyft, but costs roughly 50% more in a Waymo at $50. Another reason is political red tape. This limits where self-driving cars can operate, which is part of the reason that Waymo currently only operates in 10 areas. For example, in Washington, D.C., a critical report that's required to deploy autonomous vehicles is being withheld with little to no explanation other than budget cuts, which is slowing the rollout of self-driving cars, and there's no timetable for its release. In Boston, lawmakers mandate that all self-driving vehicles have a driver inside to take control whenever necessary, which obviously eliminates the benefits of a self-driving vehicle. Both New York and Illinois are considering similar legislation. Even in areas where Waymo does operate, they typically have restrictions. For example, if you're in an area like mine, you may see longer travel times because Waymo isn't allowed to operate on the highway with passengers. That means my commute, which typically takes about 40 minutes with me driving or taking a Lyft or an Uber, will take over an hour in a Waymo. But one of the biggest reasons for this slow adoption is public perception. Obviously, some of that comes from the sensationalized news stories that I mentioned earlier in the video, but a big part of that is this perceived lack of control. If I get into a vehicle that I'm going to drive, I'm putting trust in myself that I will get me to my destination safely. Even if I get into a vehicle that someone else is driving, I'm putting trust in that person to get myself and themselves to the destination safely. That person may be a family member, a friend, or someone who drives vehicles professionally, but I'm putting my trust in a human that has some level of self-preservation. If I get into a vehicle that drives itself, I don't necessarily know that that vehicle has that same level of self-preservation. If that vehicle gets into a collision, a replacement bumper is probably just as good as the one it already has. I, however, would not do so well if my arm was broken in a collision. Even though I know the data and the safety record of this technology, I'm still kind of nervous about getting into a vehicle that has no human driver at all and then traveling 50 miles an hour down a road. The good news is, even if adoption starts off slow, early participation can yield significant results. For example, even if only 30% of the vehicles on the road are self-driving, it could prevent 40% of vehicle crashes. That's because these vehicles don't just do a good job of avoiding collisions on their own, they often perform better in situations where a human driver is likely to make a mistake. One of the pieces of advice I often hear from other drivers is the best thing you can do on the road is be predictable. This is an area where Waymo shines. Put 10 Waymos in the exact same situation and they are all programmed to perform the same way every time. Put 10 human drivers in the exact same situation and you're going to get 10 wildly different results. Plus, unlike human drivers, Waymos won't get distracted by texting, drinking, or falling asleep. Researchers currently expect the shift to autonomous vehicles to take over a decade. That's actually a good thing because it gives us as a society time to appropriately plan for the shift to make it the most effective. For example, we need to deploy self-driving vehicles in places where they won't take traffic away from buses or trains, which are exceedingly safe. Instead, the most effective place to deploy them would be where they take traffic away from human drivers in order to have the biggest benefits. Plus, there may be benefits of self-driving cars beyond safety as well. Adjacent industries may adjust as these vehicles become more mainstream. For example, the insurance industry may offer lower premiums to people who own self-driving vehicles. They may also offer lower health and life insurance policy premiums to people who use self-driving vehicles. Rideshare services may lower costs by putting ads in vehicles similar to what you might see in a train or bus. Plus, fuel costs might be lower because these vehicles are unlikely to accelerate quickly or brake quickly, which would save on fuel. Plus, less fuel burned means less pollution, which keeps the air that we breathe cleaner. So let's talk about the experience. First off, it's pretty nice being driven around. Obviously, there are some drawbacks. Unlike vehicles with a human driver, there's no one available to help you load bags into the back of the vehicle or open the door for you. But it is nice not having to focus on driving during my commute so that I can do things like make a YouTube video for you or respond to your YouTube comments. I can charge my device with my own cable, and I can listen to my own music, which is wonderful because that isn't always an option in a Lyft or an Uber. There are some limitations that would make it very difficult for me to replace one of my vehicles with this service. First off, traveling with children would be very challenging. I would have to supply a car seat for any child that I'm traveling with, and I would have to be ready the moment the vehicle arrives. Depending on how busy the pickup area is, I get roughly 2 to 5 minutes between when the vehicle arrives and when the ride has to be started. That means I have to get the car seat safely installed, get the child safely put into the car seat, and get myself into the vehicle before the vehicle cancels the ride. If I have 2 children, that would be impossible for me to do in 2 minutes. Unlike vehicles with human drivers, Waymos are robots, so there's not any wiggle room in that time frame if I go 10 seconds over. Another restriction that would prevent me from replacing my vehicles with one of these is that Waymos don't allow pets in the vehicle because the next rider may be allergic. That's a totally reasonable requirement, but as a pet owner, that would prevent me from replacing my vehicle with one of these because from time to time, I need to take my pet to the vet. However, if you're not in one of those situations, let's talk about if it makes sense to replace owning a vehicle with using a self-driving car. The first thing we need to get into is the cost of vehicle ownership. There are several factors, including purchase price, insurance, maintenance, gasoline, and registration costs. Purchase price is pretty straightforward. Simply add up all of the costs associated with purchasing the vehicle, including any interest paid on the loan. I'm not going to include purchase price in my calculation because we've already paid for this vehicle. Insurance can vary from person to person and from vehicle to vehicle as well. But for me, on this 2021 GLS, it costs about $2,600 per year. Maintenance is pretty easy for me as well because I've already done a video on what it costs to maintain this 2021 GLS, and last year it was $4,485.71. And if you haven't seen that video, you should go check it out. Registration with our state last year was $690. For fuel, I calculated the price of gas at $5 per gallon and divided it by the EPA combined 21 miles per gallon for the GLS450. That gave me 24 cents per mile. If I replaced our GLS with a self-driving car service, I would only use it to get to and from work because we would use our Audi for everything else. So I took that 24 cents per mile and multiplied it by 38 miles per day, which is 19 miles each way to and from work, then multiplied that by the number of weekdays in 2026, which is 261. That gave me a total annual cost just shy of $2,400 per year for gasoline. Obviously, that doesn't include gasoline for any errands I need to run or leisure trips I want to take, but I wanted to focus on my guaranteed driving. All in, my total cost of ownership for the GLS450 was $10,174.43. Next, let's look at Waymo, and we'll also compare it to Lyft and Uber. For Waymo, it's roughly $50 each way to and from work, which is $100 a day. Multiply that by the 261 days we mentioned earlier, and that's $26,100 per year. For Lyft and Uber, it's roughly $35 each way, or $70 a day. Multiply that by 261 days, and it's $18,270 per year. Obviously, for me, it would cost more to get rid of my GLS and replace it with any of these ride-sharing services. However, the numbers get significantly better if I had not yet purchased my vehicle and instead was factoring in the cost of purchasing a $60,000 certified pre-owned GLS over the next 7 years. If I do that, the cost of owning that vehicle is roughly comparable to the cost of using Lyft or Uber. In that case, Waymo still costs an extra $8,000 every year, so that may not be a good deal unless you factor in the time savings you get from being able to focus on something else during your commute instead of driving. Since I'm the only one in the vehicle, I don't have to worry about making small talk with a driver, and I can get right to work. Aside from the fact that there are cameras and microphones to monitor passengers and make sure they're not doing anything inappropriate, there's really not much restriction on what a passenger can do. That makes it pretty attractive for anyone that needs to maximize their time. So that's a look at what it's like to ride in a self-driving car, why one doctor is calling them a public health breakthrough, and whether or not it makes sense to replace these human-driven vehicles with self-driving ones. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button below and subscribe for more great car safety content.